So good afternoon. Thank you for joining us today for planning a wedding, a poolside chat. Getting married, as we know, is one of the most exciting events that many people experience in their lifetime. It's exciting, but it also can be stressful. So today we're having what we're calling a poolside chat to share with you some of the great tips and ideas to help you in planning your wedding. And because there's quite a bit of information that we're going to share with you, we've divided this into 3 segments. And so this first segment is you got engaged, now what? And today we are joined by Sarah, our community development event manager, and she will be leading our discussion today. She comes with a wealth of knowledge and insider information, from planning her own wedding to helping friends and family members plan theirs too. And she will tell you more about her background. So with that said, I'm gonna toss it to Sarah.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today. As Lisa stated, I'm the Community Development Events Manager here at the Credit Union. I've been in this position for almost 4 years now. I've roughly planned and executed 10-ish weddings over my career, and I have over 15 years of corporate event planning experience. With my largest corporate event that I planned to date was roughly 1,800 people.
Awesome. Thank you, Sarah, for sharing your background and experience. And we're going to jump right into our first question to Sarah. So Sarah, how will the couple determine their budget?
Yeah, so first, I just wanted to, just because we're still somewhat in the midst of COVID right now, hopefully we're on the tail end of it and, moving forward. But I just wanted to first start out by saying that we'll be discussing details for an event wedding, not in relation to COVID elements or pieces, just due to the complexity of making arrangements and factoring in details pertaining to the pandemic, mostly because of the location, the state that you're either getting married or having your event in. If it's outside of Arizona, there's different restrictions in different states, as we all know. And also venues are individually operating by their own set of guidelines. So mostly that's pertaining to your guest count in terms of how many can be there and whatnot. So my number one recommendation to brides that I've talked to over the last 12 months is I would plan for a 2022 wedding and beyond, or event. I think you'll really thank yourself. I did see that a few were in the next 6 months, and so that would kind of take us to the end of the year, which I think, again, hopefully we're at the tail end of things. But just kind of keeping some of that information in mind in the back of your head, that all of the information we'll be giving is not pertaining to COVID restrictions. So you'll just want to check with those that you're making reservations with to make sure there aren't, if there are any restrictions, that you're aware of them up front. And so to go, oh yeah, go ahead, Lisa.
I was going to say that's definitely good advice. I know that a lot of states are starting to open back up, but there may be some states that are being still a little bit more precautious. So thank you for giving us those kind of mini guidelines to operate within pertaining to COVID.
Definitely.
So let's let's jump in and talk about kind of the budgeting aspect and what couples really should consider, whether you're getting married, or I noticed in our survey information, there were a couple of folks that were planning major events. What are some of those things that they should do to determine their budget?
Definitely. So the first thing I always tell people is determine what your top three things that are most important to you and your partner, because for your wedding, if your partner is just like, you know, go ahead, do the planning, or they want some say. So I usually say it's like 3 or 4. If your partner does want some say, 2 for him, 2 for you. Or if it's just you kind of determining what those are, what are those 3 top things that are most important to you? Once you figure out those items, place them at the top of your budget and figure out what those 3 or 4 items will cost, or research what the average cost is. If you do research on the average cost, you're going to roughly add 50% to it. This is because being that it's one of your top items, you aren't going to spend the average. You're going to spend above average. And so that really helps you to stay focused, that those are kind of the 3 items that you're going to allow yourself to somewhat kind of splurge on a little bit. That's going to be like a major focus. It just helps with all the other items to just let those kind of fall into place, not to get too overly concerned with them, because it's a lot. When we're in the webinar, we'll share a document that really lists the things out, and there's a lot of things. So if you keep focused on those 3 things, it'll really help you kind of hone in on just the overall planning process, and kind of where things are falling. From there, you're gonna you wanna look over the Word document, which we've created, like I stated, and start crossing off items that just aren't of interest to you, or things that you're just not wanting to have at your wedding or your events that you're having. So for example, one of the things that's listed on here is like childcare, pet costs. If you don't have children, you don't have pets, you can cross those off, right? But go through and circle the items that you want to incorporate into your wedding. When in doubt, circle versus cross off. That way you want to account for everything, and you'll be a little bit under budget at the end of the day versus over budget, because honestly, everything really does add up. Once you have your list of your top 3 or 4 items, and your list, you have your list of things that you want to include within your wedding, you can start jotting down the cost of these things. If you're unsure, a simple Google search for average cost of a wedding cake or average cost of wedding ceremony efficient. Again, these are just averages, so it helps to give you that median, that baseline, so that when you're calling different places, you're getting different quotes, you kind of know where those are falling. Are they falling above? Or are they falling below? Remember that these are estimates and the overall cost of what everything is going to cost, but don't stress out. You can remove things from your list or reconsider how much time you need to save and budget for the type of wedding that you want. This is also to help you get into the frame of mind to understand what things cost based on the number of people you want to invite and that you would like to have at your wedding.
Awesome. And so while Sarah was talking about the list, I actually did share that list with you so that you were aware of some of the items that she was referring to. And we will be sharing that list after the webinar. So the other item that we had talked about was the average cost of the wedding. And I want to share with you, kind of along the same lines of keeping the cost in mind for your budget, want to go ahead and share with you that next document so that you can see some of the items that Sarah was referring to. And so initially, when we talked about the wedding being over $30,000, you can see based off of some of these average wedding costs, how things can really add up. And so that basically leads me to the next question. Bear with me as I get back to my notes. Some of the things, bear with me, some of the things that you should consider to help you figure out kind of what you can afford and what some of those things are, or that you need to keep in mind when planning your budget.
Yeah, so you first want to ask yourself the question, what can we afford? You're going to want to look at your monthly household budget if you don't have one. It's a great time to create one. I know Lisa and Sully have multiple series that talk about household budgets and how to do that. And so that's a great plug for that webinar if you've not attended before. But you want to understand how much money you're going to need to put in a wedding savings account each month, or just understanding, you know, what that dollar amount is going to cost at the end of the day when it's all totaled up. So if you are doing a wedding savings account or an event savings account, and you know that you have an extra $250 per month, multiply that by the number of months of when you're wanting to get married, and this will likely give you a reality check, right? As to like how much monthly you're needing to save or how much extra. You can also write, if you come up with your tally of, you know, things that you want to incorporate into your wedding, and you've got an average cost, getting that total and dividing it by 6 months, 12 months, and so on, to help you understand from the monthly standpoint what that's going to cost. You also want to consider your situation. Do you have family or friends that can help you pay for some of the costs related to your wedding or your event? Make sure to factor that in when looking at the total amount that you need to save. And also, the number one thing that I tell people all the time is give yourself the gift of time. If you want to get married in the next 3 months, 3 months after getting engaged, and you're on a strict household budget, make sure to think about your wedding or event in realistic terms. What you'll be able to afford if you save for 3 months versus 12 months versus 18 months. I always say, why rush? This is supposed to be a fun experience planning your wedding, not stressful. It's a once in a lifetime event, and so have fun and do things that aren't going to stress you out, because getting married in itself is stressful. And so, you know, different individuals have different thought processes on how to pay for things. And that actually comes into play in our next segment, where we really talk about how you're going to actually pay for things and some different ideas of how to go about figuring that aspect of your event or wedding.
Awesome. And with regard to costs, Sarah, what would you say about kind of estimating or overestimating? What are your tips?
Yeah, always overestimating is great, because you always want to come in under budget versus over budget. You also want to put aside funds for contingency. You will tap into that. My husband and I tapped into ours, and so I was very grateful to be able to have that set aside. I think realistically for contingency, I would place anywhere, depending on the size, 1,000 to 5,000 within that, just to make sure that you have the dollars there in case you need to tap into that.
And when you talk about contingencies, you know, to me, I hear out of the box things, or things that you may not have necessarily planned for in your original budget. Were there any kind of out of the box things? And can you give us some tips about honeymoon expenses?
Yeah, so for us, what we used our contingency dollars on was boarding for our dogs. We were gone for a total of 14 days for our actual ceremony, for our actual wedding, as well as our honeymoon. And so when we came back, it was roughly a $700 cost for boarding our pups for those 14 days that we just did not anticipate. It was a huge shock. There was a lot going on when I dropped them off. Obviously, we dropped them off the day before we were leaving for our wedding. So just to kind of keep those little things in mind, as well as like your guest list, right? Maybe someone said no and now they're saying yes, and that could add up very quickly depending on, again, like the size of your wedding, how many people you're having there. So, and then in reference to your question, Lisa, for honeymoon expenses, definitely place this in your budget. I've talked to so many brides, so many couples where they don't factor that into their budget. But if you think about it, how much it costs just to go on a trip, just in normal circumstances, right? It adds up really quickly. If you're looking at flights for the two of you, you're looking at hotel costs, you're looking at rental cars wherever you're going, things like that. And so I know a lot of people really, do it up for their honeymoon, which is amazing. I totally think that you should. One of my husband and I's top 3 was our honeymoon. And so we put a lot of emphasis around our honeymoon. We actually planned our entire wedding around our honeymoon. That was the most important thing for us. And so we, we really factored that in to make sure that we could have the honeymoon that we wanted. And it wasn't an afterthought. It wasn't, do everything for the wedding and then, whatever we have left is what will be in our honeymoon, budget. So definitely factor that in, because I think that's one expense that a lot of times people tend to leave out, that is pretty significant in cost.
Awesome tip. So everyone, don't forget about your fur babies. And if they need boarding, make sure you account for that in your budget, as well as some of the things in considering your honeymoon expenses can also be used to factor in if you're having a destination wedding, right? And Sarah talked about the gift of time. You definitely want to give the gift of time to your attendees for those destination weddings so that they can save up the funds that are needed. So, and realistically giving yourself enough time to save money, Sarah, talk to us. What does that look like? I think you originally mentioned probably 6 months to a year, but talk a little bit about that.
Definitely. So I know in the poll we saw there was a few planning within the 6-month time frame, which it's totally doable. It's just the complexity, or on the flip side, the simplicity that you make of your event. So I always tell people the larger the wedding, 60+ people, the more time you need to give yourself. There's a lot of benefits to planning a year in advance, such as getting the location you want, getting the date you want. If you don't have a year, just consider downsizing less than 30 for the number of guests that you'll invite, or better yet, elope. It's something my husband and I honestly considered. Other ideas are you can always get married somewhere, which is you and your significant other, and then have a party with family and friends a few months later. This will all help with the overall cost, and sometimes can be even more memorable and special. I've had actually multiple friends that have done this, getting married a little bit later in life. And then somewhat what Lisa mentioned on for destination weddings, there's a myth that they're less expensive, and that's just not true. I think it's a lure of the all-inclusive kind of feel that they go for, but you just want to read between the lines. You want to make sure what is, quote, all-inclusive, but you also want to make sure that you give those that you're going to invite enough time to save the money for your destination wedding if they're having to come up with the cost. So if you say, you're getting married in Jamaica in 3 months and it's roughly going to cost $3,500 to attend, for most people, that's a lot of money in a short amount of time. And that's like usually per person. So if you think for a couple, that's roughly $7,000. So just make sure to kind of factor that in your overall planning. And then the number one cost to kind of understand with your budget is your food and beverage, as well as the size of venue you'll need to rent or use for the number of folks that you'll be inviting. Those are going to be your two number one largest costs. And so, examples of ways to kind of get around, you have to understand these are businesses, right? So they are out to be a business and make money and be profitable. I think I saw some crazy number of the wedding industry and just how significant it is in terms of what they make every year in that industry. And so examples of like workarounds that you can potentially look at is renting an Airbnb or VRBO for your reception or your ceremony or your event. Sometimes properties will not allow parties or gatherings, but if you have time, you can be persistent in making phone calls and shopping around. You'll probably get more no's than yeses, but it's well worth it in putting in that effort. And that goes for anything. Being able to shop around is huge. If you are on a time crunch and you're just saying yes to the first person that you find, for multiple reasons, you probably don't want to go in that direction, just because you want to make sure that you validate their work. If it's a photographer, if it's a florist, you want to look at some of their past work to make sure it's in line with what you want. And then also understanding where their prices compared to others. And so this takes a lot of time. You have to think, for most people, right, you're doing this on nights and weekends. We all have our full-time day job. And so doing this takes quite a bit of time with the phone calls and jotting everything down. So just some tidbits to keep in mind as you're kind of going through the process.
Awesome advice, Sarah. Awesome advice. I want to delve into just quickly, you talked about some of the out of the box expenses or unusual expenses. And I want to have you kind of maybe ad lib on an expense that would be a surprise to people. So for example, like maybe your wedding dress.
Yeah. So for me, it was wedding alterations to my dress. And I had asked several friends that had recently been married, and they told me, and I was like, no way, it's not that much, right? And when my dress came in, it was a very quick turnaround time. I'm talking like 5 days. From the time it came in to the time that we left for our wedding. And I didn't really have a choice other than use the business in which I purchased my dress to do my alterations. And so the cost was exactly what my girlfriends had told me. And so I was just so incredibly shocked and surprised of how much alterations costed. And that wasn't even necessarily like expedited, if you will. Same with a dress. Like I had no idea how long it took to get a dress, and that expedited fees if you needed it sooner than, I think mine was like a 7-month process of getting my dress. And so for me, that was one of my top 3 as well. So there was a lot of emphasis on my dress, and I put a lot of time and attention towards that. And so when you're doing that, things tend to add up, things pop in, right? When it's one of your top 3, you're kind of allowing yourself to have that additional emphasis on that item. But that's where that contingency money really comes into play. And so based on the 2 things that were a surprise, boarding our pups as well as the alterations on my dress, you can see how, you can get to $2,000 like really quickly. So it just starts to add up really, really fast. And so you just always, like I said, making that contingency budget anywhere from $1,000 to $5,000, you will thank yourself for doing that at the end of the day.
Awesome. And it just sounds like there's a lot of things to juggle during this time and to remember. And so with that, my final question for you, Sarah, is are there any online resources to get information costs for certain wedding items?
Yeah, so I think if we're sharing, there's a simple calculator that you can use. You can Google it, simple wedding calculator, just to understand ballparks that you can anticipate for things that you'll need, as well as the infographic that we shared earlier that really outlines some rough estimates. I think this was so eye-opening for my husband. He had no idea what some of this stuff costs. And so when I was sharing with him, he was just like blown away, like, oh my gosh, I never would have thought that flowers would be, this cost. And so just don't forget to insert estimates on all the smaller items as well. And then also talking to friends and family, maybe that have gotten married in the last 3 years, just how much they spent on certain things is just a form of reference. Again, to make sure, right, you're not on the high, you're not on the low, you're kind of coming in right in the middle with whomever you're working with or what you're looking to do. I always say that Google, the internet, is your best friend, not necessarily Pinterest. While Pinterest is amazing for ideas, looking at photos on there, those are typically professional photos where budget probably wasn't, intended there. And so they can kind of, the sky's the limit, right? Or if it's a corporate event, right? There's a lot of budget and dollars that can be put behind that. So use Pinterest again as a form of reference for ideas, things, colors you're looking at, inspiration, but not necessarily as like your playbook.
Great. Awesome tips and advice. And so as we round out this 30 minutes, I want to kind of talk about or identify the top 3 things that you want to consider as you plan for your big day or special event. So number 1, you want to make sure you give yourself as much time as possible. As Sarah mentioned earlier, give yourself the gift of time. Number 2, pick the top 3 items or 4 items that are most important to you and your significant other to planning that big day or big event. And the 3rd and final item is stick to your budget. If you don't have a budget, definitely take the opportunity to develop one, but stick to the budget you set initially. It's really easy, as Sarah has mentioned, to start adding things. Little things add up, and it's easy to overspend on things that you really initially may not have wanted in your wedding or may not even care about. So with that said, I want to close out our first session and invite you all to join our upcoming sessions. The next session after this is I Wish Money Grew on Trees. And the final session is tips and tricks that wedding planners don't want you to know. So with that said, have a great afternoon, and we'll see you on the next session.